Having said that, let me just spend a few minutes, if I can, on Ukraine to put this in context. This was, I think, by our count, about the 50th call or video conference the President has had with his European counterparts since the beginning of this crisis. And ever since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its campaign to destabilize Ukraine, the President has led the international effort to isolate Russia for its actions in Ukraine, to support Ukraine itself, and to reassure our allies. This effort has produced major strategic gains. We've created space for Ukraine to hold successful presidential elections, despite Russian efforts to disrupt them, and that's produced the strongest leadership Ukraine has seen since the end of the Cold War. We created space for Ukraine to sign an association agreement with the European Union, despite Russian efforts to prevent that. And recall that the former President Yanukovych's last-minute about-face on signing that association agreement is exactly what precipitated this crisis in the first place. And we forged a robust financial support package for Ukraine led by the IMF. None of these things just happened. They were the result of a major, sustained effort by the President to lead the international community. All of that said, the challenge to Ukraine remains acute. Ukrainian forces are right now making major gains to regain sovereignty in the east, but at the same time, Russia is doubling down on its own efforts to support the separatists and destabilize the country. Indeed, it is cynically using all of the attention focused on the crash of MH17 as a cover and distraction for its own efforts. It's increased the provision of heavy weaponry across the border. We've seen convoys of tanks, multiple rocket launchers, artillery, and armored vehicles. There's evidence it's preparing to deliver even more powerful multiple rocket launchers. It is firing from positions inside of Russia into Ukraine, something that we documented this weekend. And we've seen a significant rebuild-up of Russian forces along the border, potentially positioning Russia for a so-called humanitarian or peacekeeping intervention in Ukraine. So there's urgency to arresting these developments, to ending the efforts to destabilize Ukraine. And the urgency is this. First, everything we're seeing is a real drag on the Ukrainian economy. The military expenditures that Ukraine has to make are a drag, and the fact that Luhansk and Donetsk, which represent 15% of Ukrainian GDP and about 25% of its manufacturing exports, are basically taken out of the Ukrainian economic equation, is also a drag on the economy. Second, the longer this goes on, there's the risk of further outrageous actions by the separatists or by Russia that deepen the international crisis. So there is a need to take further action now to convince Russia to change course and cease its efforts to destabilize Ukraine. On the call, the European leaders clearly shared this assessment and a determination to act. We expect the European Union to take significant additional steps this week, including in key sectors of the Russian economy. In turn, and in full coordination with Europe, the United States will implement additional measures itself. Our purpose here, again, is not to punish Russia, but to make clear that it must cease its support for the separatists and stop destabilizing Ukraine. Let me just finish by putting this in a larger context. Everything we've seen as a result of Russia's actions and the actions that the President has led in the international community over these many months has turned what is happening in Ukraine into a strategic loser for Russia. First, we've seen a dramatic impact on the Russian economy by the sanctions that the United States, Europeans, and others have taken. These are acknowledged by the Russian finance minister and indeed the deputy prime minister, even Putin himself. Sberbank, the largest bank in Russia and a proxy for the larger economy, a month ago in announcing a steep decline in profits said, in particular, recent events in Ukraine significantly impacted the dynamics of the Russian economy. We've seen the financial markets go up and down, the ruble hitting lows. The central bank has had to spend $37 billion to defend the ruble, about 8% of its foreign exchange holdings. The result is higher borrowing costs and a decrease in the value of Russian savings. Capital flight, $70 billion in the first half of this year, more than all of 2013 combined, and projections for the entire year put it at between $100 and $200 billion. Foreign investment is drying up. Investors are looking for stability. They're looking on countries that keep their international commitments. They're looking on countries that are connected to the international economy. On all three counts, Russia is giving them great pause. The credit rating for Russia was cut to just above the junk level. Financing deals are frozen. Russian companies are not issuing bonds to raise capital. And as we've seen overall, Russia is heading for economic contraction, not growth, a significant reversal from just a few months ago. Let me add as well, there's talk that Russia has, quote unquote, won Crimea. But the fact of the matter is, what's happened is it's lost Ukraine. Ukraine is more united in a Western orientation than ever before, and there's a much greater sense of national identity. We produced, as I mentioned before, the space for elections and the signing of the association agreement with the European Union. Crimea itself is becoming a deadweight on the Russian economy. $7 billion a year at least in budget and pension support, 50 to 60 billion required over the next several years for critical infrastructure, and Russians themselves are asking why this money is being spent in Crimea and not in Russia. There's downward pressure on defense spending. There's downward pressure on discretionary spending as a result of this. We've seen this, the actions in Ukraine re-energize NATO. There's a deeper commitment to Article 5. The NATO itself, it now has a virtual regular presence, a continuous air, land, and sea presence on the territory adjacent to Russia. And we'll see what happens at the NATO summit, but there's at least the prospect now for reversing the downward trend in defense spending. We've seen on energy reform a jolt to the Europeans to take real steps to decrease dependence, to diversify supply, to upgrade infrastructure, to develop new sources. And then finally, I would say this. For the Russians and for President Putin, power equals a combination of geopolitical influence and economic strength to provide for the Russian people. There was a recent survey, in Russia. The top two priorities of the Russian people were evenly split: international influence and creating the conditions for individual prosperity. As a result of Russia's actions in Ukraine and as a result of the leadership we've exerted, both of those are in jeopardy. And so is President Putin's compact with his own people. There is a way out. Integrate Russia with the international economy, diversify away from fossil fuels, and play by the rules. That is still on offer. That is still a possibility. We would like nothing better than to resolve this crisis in Ukraine diplomatically, and that's now up to President Putin. Thank you.